Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to a very special episode of the show. Today, the 26th of July 2024, is the opening ceremony of the Paris 24 Olympics. And to mark that occasion, I've invited on the show a guest who was part of the London 2012 Olympic opening and closing ceremonies. Now, the reason I'm interested in Olympic opening ceremonies is because of a story that I feature in my book, Humanising Rules. You can download the first few chapters of that, incidentally, for free via a link in the show notes. Here's what I wrote in the book. It's in a chapter about how it's important, if we want to persuade others to follow our rules, that we understand things from their perspective. Save the surprise. In 2012, the multi-award-winning film director Danny Boyle directed a performance unlike anything he'd directed before. As artistic director of the opening ceremony of the London Olympic Games, he was responsible for a live show costing £27 million that would be performed in front of 80,000 spectators in the stadium and billions of TV viewers worldwide. To ensure things ran as smoothly as possible on the night, Boyle invited 60,000 Olympic volunteers, prize winners and other guests to a technical rehearsal 5 days before the actual ceremony. In order to maintain secrecy around the show's contents, Boyle spoke to the audience and asked them not to share photographs or details of the event on social media. Having told them they were among the first people in the world to see the show, he asked for their help to save the surprise, and the hashtag Save the Surprise was displayed on screens in the stadium. Boyle crossed his fingers that nothing major would leak. It didn't. Rather than sharing details of the show, people shared their thoughts about it using the hashtag. What Boyle had realised was the fact his audience would naturally want to talk about what they'd seen. By explaining why he needed them not to reveal details of the show, and recognising that Save the Surprise would be far more appealing than, say, Keep the Secret, Boyle persuaded the audience to willingly do what he wanted them to. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given he's a film director, Boyle had not only understood his audience, but he'd also ensured they understood what he wanted. When I shared that on LinkedIn recently, Victoria Sena, a former colleague of mine from when I worked as a regulator, we were both at the UK Financial Services Authority and its successor organisation, the Prudential Regulation Authority at the Bank of England, got in touch to tell me she'd actually been part of the ceremony and had some interesting insights to share. Having someone with regulatory experience able to give me the inside track on what actually happened during the ceremony seemed like a really interesting idea. So I invited Victoria onto the show, and I'm really pleased I did, because what you're about to hear are some fascinating stories from backstage. Discover how Victoria got her role in the ceremony, the meticulous planning that went into the event, and how director Danny Boyle used psychology to get thousands of volunteers to make a huge personal commitment to allow him to put on the show. You'll hear about the links they went to keep things secret, including, of course, Save the Surprise, what goes into creating an opening ceremony, and lots of other lessons that are relevant to both human risk and compliance. I think you're not only going to find this fascinating, but it'll give you a whole different perspective on what goes into making the Olympics. So as you settle down to watch the ceremonies and the sports unfold, this is your perfect accompaniment. So please enjoy, as I know you will, my discussion with Victoria Sena on saving the surprise. Victoria, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Hi.
And look, you and I used to work together back in 2012, but I thought just to start us off, why don't you tell my listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So as you said, I started my career at the regulator. So I joined in March 2010 on the grad scheme. And the grad scheme was fantastic, actually, because it meant I got to rotate around different areas in the regulator. So I did 18 months in authorizations, and then I did a stint in international banks where we worked together. After that, I did a secondment to what was the Department of Energy and Climate Change as a policy advisor. And then I came back to the Bank of England. And actually, you had a hand in this career move because I came back to international banks, but I wanted to move to the insurance division so that I could work on the climate change report. And you made that happen. So thank you. It was a real turning point in my career. So I worked on the Bank of England's climate change adaptation report, and that was received with great fanfare. You know, Mark Carney was particularly happy with it. It made the Financial Times, which was fantastic. And after that stint, I then did another comment to the Treasury Select Committee as a committee specialist. And while I was there, I worked on a report about the impact of Solvency II on the insurance industry alongside a bunch of others. But it was a fascinating time to be there. I got to Parliament in February 2016, so just before Brexit, and then I saw Brexit happen, and a new election being called. Unfortunately, the terrorist attacks happening as well. So I saw the best of Parliament and the people that worked there. So that was my public sector career. Once that position ended, I felt like 8 years was a good time to move on into the private sector. So I switched over to I moved to an insurance company originally as a risk manager, and then I set up my own consultancy, doing operations, risk, and compliance work. And fortunately, one of those clients offered me a COO role. So I was a COO of an asset manager for 3.5 years, and I'm now the COO of a wealth advisor firm called 𝗀𝗗cie𝗽𝗹𝗲, and we provide advice to high net worth families. So that takes us up to today.
There we go. And look, you mentioned that we worked together. This was back, God, like we don't want to think too hard about when that was, but we have to name the time, which was around the 2012 Olympics in London. And there's the story of the opening ceremony. So I talked about this before, and you got in touch with me and said, well, actually, I was part of that. And I thought this would be really interesting to get you on the show to talk a little bit about the other perspective. What was it like to be there? So talk us through, what was the decision making around volunteering for the Olympics? Because it was open to everybody, but what made you decide to do it?
So really the driving force behind my decision was that, the Olympics is like the circus, and the circus was coming to town, and I just had to be a part of it. I cannot imagine London having a party and me not being involved in it. So, short of suddenly qualifying in one of the sports, this was really the route in. And so it really happened by luck, because what was the FSA was approached to provide staff members to interview games makers.
Games maker is the term for people volunteering.
Yeah, exactly. So the games makers were people that would stand in tube stations and around the different venues to point people in the directions of where their seats were or where the food was available, all volunteers. But in order to get that population, they needed to interview people. So they approached the FSA and said, could you spare some staff to do those interviews? So I was a community affairs champion, and I thought, actually it'd be really a good bit of experience in interviewing. So I went along to the London Excel Centre, and I probably interviewed like 200 people. It was a lot. You did kind of shifts, and you got badges for the number of people you interviewed, and you followed a set list of questions, and it was really, really good practice. And it was really just serendipity that one of those people that I interviewed at the end of the interview said, I really want to be a games maker, but I'm also interviewing for the opening ceremony. Can I do both? And I was like, tell me about the opening ceremony. That sounds interesting. And they said, yeah, they've put it on the website, but they're not advertising it because they'll get too many people. But if you go on the London website, you can apply. So I was like, I literally went home, and it was the first thing I did, because I just thought, I like performance. I've done a bit of work in the performance world, very much amateur, but, school plays and pantomimes, things like that. And I was also in a marching band, which is, probably the most relevant experience. So I applied. And I think this is probably the first point I'd say in terms of getting people who are very compliant, because it was a matter of natural selection of keen beans during the audition process. Number one, it wasn't heavily advertised. So, I found out by chance, and people found out through the grapevine, really. The second, probably a really big point, was that the auditions were held in warehouses in East London, and they took all day. So people had to be willing to give up one of their days to go and just hang out in East London, not really knowing what was in store for them.
And I guess committing time, you might not succeed, right? So to your point, it's like what you're talking about here is a series of barriers to entry that mean that if you're actually going to get through this whole process, you haven't just sort of rocked up to something, right? You've had to go through you have to find out I guess have to show the initiative, or be lucky, as was in your case, to find out this thing was happening, then make the effort to apply, and then you go through this whole series of processes that to your point, I guess, is weeding out, for want of a better phrase, people that might not be fully committed.
Exactly. And the final, I suppose, barrier to entry for a lot of people would have been that there was no financial compensation. The only thing that we got the entire time was lunch and an Oyster card to use exclusively to go to our rehearsals. But other than that, if there was anybody from outside London, and indeed people did come, a really good friend of mine came all the way down from Scotland, they were paying for their transport and their accommodation. So, once again, it really whittled down the population to people who were really, really committed to it from the beginning.
That's super interesting. And your sense is that was by design rather than by accident?
Well, I think a bit of both. I think they definitely made a choice not to advertise it on television. They could easily have got, and then they would have got 30 million people. Half the population probably would have thought, oh yeah, that sounds fun. I fancy a go at that. Why not? So I think that part was by design, but the other parts were probably by budget. The opening ceremony itself was 10,000 people just in that 3-hour opening ceremony. So if you need 10,000 people, you need to interview 100,000 people probably. So you needed a space big enough to get through that. You can't use a West End theatre. It's just not going to cut it. And then in terms of the compensation, everything was on a very tight budget. And, for example, the drums that we had were actually plant pots that were turned upside down. Our drumsticks were drumsticks that they then put tennis balls on the end of and spray painted them green. So it was really a DIY Olympic opening ceremony. Because remember, it was 2012, financial crisis was still in the rearview mirror and everything adds up. So wherever possible, savings were made. Like our costumes were, Primark and things like that. Nothing was tailored. It was, small, medium, large, extra large, and hope that something fits. So I think a bit of both.
There's something interesting there as well, I think, about if they had thrown loads of money at it, back for the compliance point, the feel would be slightly different. Whereas what you're describing is a sort of mucking in, we're doing what we can with limited resources. And so that, interestingly, I think, tends to make people a bit more engaged with it, right? You're recognizing the dynamics that are there. If it felt like something that was a bit more flush, you might, I'm guessing here, but you might think, for example, oh, well, they'll have loads of people in reserve, right? There's lots of resources behind this thing. So if I drop out or screw up or do something, it doesn't matter. Whereas actually having less budget tends to make people more resourceful. And probably, and this is a stretch here, but probably also back to the compliance thing, you're probably thinking, well, I'm critical, I'm important, I matter to this thing, because we're not awash with cash and awash with people and awash with resources. We're really having to struggle with what we've got. And so I think that is super interesting as a framing for thinking about, well, how is it you can get people to do the things that you want or not? Maybe actually sometimes being flush with resources isn't necessarily the best way to prompt that.
No, because it wasn't for the entire time period. The opening ceremony itself was quite glamorous, but before that 3-hour slot were over 200 hours of very unglamorous rehearsals in a Dagenham car park, mainly in the rain. So they could not have divas. It wouldn't work. They needed people who were really just keen beans, who were bought in, who wanted to make history and be part of it, but not have any ego whatsoever, because there just wasn't space for it.
And when you signed up to do this, how did they make that clear to you? Was it in the application stage? Was it in the interview process? Or did it just become apparent very quickly that was the way things worked?
I think it mainly just became apparent. I think a lot of people probably could take an educated guess, but when you're literally, in a warehouse and they're saying, imagine this and imagine that, and there's nothing on the wall, there's no lights, there's no cameras, it's just you and a bunch of other people in their home clothes marching on the spot. You quickly realize, like, yeah, this is going to be very basic actually, and there's something nice in that. And I think this probably brings me on to my second point around how do you make people comply, because there was a really crucial part of this was selling the dream. So, we're in a warehouse or we're in a car park, but there was a continual process of the organizers to sell the dream of what we were aiming for. So Danny Boyle was there from the very beginning. He was there during the interview process, and he was the director of the opening ceremony. And he showed us during that interview process a scale model of the stadium with a hill at one end, and he explained that hill is representative of Glastonbury Tour. And then, we had a bell and a stage at the other end where he said Bradley Wiggins will be coming out and Kenneth Brenner will be there. So he really painted a picture of what we had in store for us. And we were regularly reminded of that. So throughout our all of our rehearsals, we had an inner earpiece. So obviously AirPods didn't exist at that point, right? Crazy, but they just didn't exist. So everybody had cables running up through their shirts with an earpiece. And in there, you would have a click track, which literally is click, 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 click to keep everybody in time. And then overlaid in that, you'd have the music. And then overlaid with that, you would have people giving you instructions and directions. And quite often they would be painting a picture for us because we'd be in a car park and they'd say things like, if you look to your left, a parade of all things British will appear. Think the Beatles, and they're going to look amazing. And there'll be all of these people in soldier gear, and there'll be the Windrush is going to be there as well. So just imagine how amazing that's going to look. And you're stretching your imagination to its absolute limit. But it was important because 200 hours in a car park in pouring with rain, you needed that regular reminder of this is just a small part of something that is so much bigger than anybody individually.
As you were talking, I was thinking about, and I'm assuming that nobody was getting paid for this, right? So Danny Boyle is not getting paid, the celebrities not getting, and clearly if you're like a musician or something, you're going to want to be part of this, right? Because he's the biggest show on earth at that particular point in time. But I guess the idea of having everybody volunteering, again, prompts to another dynamic in terms of the compliance piece, because you're sort of, it's a different set of circumstances. The moment you start paying people, you turn it into a financial transaction. The terms and conditions, I guess, both the legal contractual terms and conditions, but also just the emotional social ones would change. And so I think there's something interesting there about you're totally there as a you could walk away and never come back, and therefore you're going to do what they want you to do because you're there for the right reasons.
Yeah, exactly. In terms of payments, I think there was a small population that was paid, and they were the professionals. So they had professional drummers and professional dancers. But in terms of the scale of things, there were 10,000 people in the entire opening ceremony. 1,000 of those were drummers, and about 20 professional drummers were there. And they were there to literally teach people how to drum and to help organize. We'll get onto kind of hierarchies later, but it was a very, very few people received a salary. I would imagine that, I wouldn't know for sure, but I imagine all of those celebrities like J.K. Rowling, Daniel Craig, they were doing it for Britain, for London, for the UK, not really for their pocket as such. And then, yeah, the other thing that Danny did actually, because, it's looking back now, because it was such a success, it's easy to forget that actually there was a lot of bad press around it at the time. So I remember picking up a copy of the Evening Standard and showing it to Danny Boyle because he was always there every day. And it had a picture of what was then the stadium, and it just looked like a ramshackle of clutter, different props all over the place. There was like dead grass here and a tree had fallen over and like a random wheel, because it was all the different props were just there in this picture. And Danny just laughed at it, and he held up to everybody and he would like, let them laugh now, but we're going to blow them out of the water. Like, we'll be laughing later. Just absolute conviction in his vision, that quiet confidence. And it just gave everybody peace of mind that trust Danny Boyle. He's an Oscar-winning director. He knows what he's doing. He's been in this business long enough. We don't need to worry about the naysayers.
That's interesting, because of all the people reputationally, right, he's got most at stake here.
Yeah.
Because if you're part of something to screw up, you can blame someone else and go, it was chaos, it was disorganized chaos or whatever, right? And unless you chose to tell people, they would never know that you were associated with it, right? Whereas he's got his name on the line. So I think that's a really interesting dynamic here that says, in order to get all of this to work properly, you need the person at the top to have very clear vision and not to be dissuaded or influenced by things, and just know that this is going to work. And that then creates the culture. I mean, literally, this is tone from the top, right? This is really sending you a signal. And I think that's absolutely fascinating in that context, because he has got everything. So you would think he'd have every reason. You show him a newspaper that goes, looks like a shit show. You would think he'd have every reason to kind of be swayed by that. But actually, because he's done this before and he knows how this works, right? It's the opposite. It's the cool, calm confidence that then gets everybody else to behave in the way that you want.
Yeah. And that segues on nicely to the third point I had around compliance, which is that he hired the best in business to get this thing done. So just incredible people. It was meticulous planning by this world-class team. And what I realized early on is essentially the Olympics are a bit like a traveling circus, because the team that worked on London had previously worked on the Canadian 2010 Winter Olympics. Before that, they had done the Beijing 2008 Olympics, which had a big drumming section. Before that, somebody had even mentioned kind of Greece and Italy as well. So these are people who have really trodden these boards for many, many years and are used to working with each other. There was never any raised voices. Nobody ever shouted at anybody. It was constant calm and trust at that kind of higher leadership level, which then trickled down. And of course, those organisers were then joined by film stars like David Beckham, Paul McCartney, Daniel Craig, and the late Queen Elizabeth II even made a feature. So, when you're just as a volunteer and you hear these names being dropped, you're like, wow, okay, like this is big. If David Beckham's involved and the Queen is involved, gosh, like I'm going to be part of something massive. No one can touch this, essentially. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have those professionals that just helped keep people in line. So it kind of connected Danny Boyle with 10,000 people. But you really, in terms of middle management, very few people. It was really the culture needed to work to keep everybody in line.
And so I think this is super interesting because obviously the big names are necessary for the show, right? So that gives the show glitz and glamour and memorable moments. But that's a really interesting comment that you made because it's helping you to focus on it because you're sort of thinking, okay, you got confidence that this thing is going to work. And I love that idea of kind of having these itinerant professionals. And I'm assuming they will have been paid, right? Logically, if you're moving from games to games, you're acquiring a very unique skill set that probably does at some point, maybe the first games they do, they volunteer and then they work it up and it becomes your career, I guess, right? Just to shift from games to games. And and I love your circus analogy, right? Because the circus is just going to keep on going somewheres. And even if the circus stops for some reason, this is a useful skill set. So that's a really interesting. So you've got this kind of professional cadre of people that are there. And so all of these things point towards your confidence that, it's going to happen, right? Because the date has been set, it's there. But your confidence of participating in the event is driven by the fact that, yes, it's all do-it-yourself. I mean this in the nicest possible way, amateur hour in the sense of the average participant. There's a professional underlaying of it. And those things, I guess, that gives you the confidence that matters. So on the subliminal level, what's effective for the show, the stars, what goes into managing professional processes is there. And that's what allows you to take this ragtag army of volunteers who've never done anything like this before, which is the reason that they're there. And that's what allows you to professionalize that, I guess.
Like, absolutely the case. It was really tempting. I remember just doing it. And then when I came back to the FSA, it was a real kind of crash down to earth because, you'd been surrounded by, celebrities and just incredible people. And you're in this world of glitz and glamour and showbiz. And like, I was on the TV, like, that's incredible. And then you get back to your desk and you're like, how can I join the circus? I need to be there. I want to be in Brazil.
Well, some people listening to this might, of course, go that you went from a slickly run event to the circus or back to the circus, but let's park.
Yeah, it's it was a real come down, I'm not gonna lie. Just the adrenaline, but the adrenaline of the opening ceremony itself was unmatched. Like, I was just fizzing for hours, and we were the last people to see it, right? Ironically, because we were in the show, and the show, it was very segmented. So you only knew, and we'll come on to this, but you only rehearsed your part until we did the 3 live rehearsals. And even the 3 live rehearsals, they kept things back from everybody. So you didn't have the Queen kind of jumping out of a helicopter on the rehearsal nights. And so when we all went to the pub afterwards, to be honest, and we were probably out until kind of 2-3 in the morning. So I watched the ceremony the next day on the iPlayer, and like I was just in tears because it was like, wow, like I was part of that, and everything went to plan. So there was a huge amount of pride involved in it for sure, and it's still like my fun fact about myself is that I was in the Olympic opening ceremony. But I will say nothing went wrong on the night, but that's because we did so many rehearsals over and over again, the same things over and over again. Like I said, it was over 200 hours. The rehearsals themselves, we were doing normally about 5 hours on a Sunday or on a Saturday or a Sunday, sometimes both. And quite often you would just be sitting around waiting for your time to get onto the stage, which was the car park. So we did lots of problem solving during that process. So for example, if you cast your mind back to the opening ceremony, when it opens, the stadium is a green and pleasant land. So it's covered in grass. It has live sheep, which was crazy. They had live animals. They had people playing cricket. There were children running around doing a Mayfair pole. And there were the houses that were like cottages. And these were all sets. And all of this needed to be removed to reveal the Victorian industrial era. And the only way that was going to happen is by getting people to physically carry that stuff off of the stage. So that section was known as the Green and Pleasant Land. And the Green and Pleasant cast was, again, 1,000 people. And those 1,000 people basically did manual labor for free every weekend from like January until July. And that was tough. And for some of them, it was a bit too much. And people started dropping out. And Danny Boyle just jumped into action and he met those 1,000 people. He shook every single person's hand, had a conversation with them, injected them again with that, the vision that he had, with his charisma, with his absolute passion and belief for it. Because at the stage they were dropping out, there was no way to backfill them. And they needed 1,000 people. It wasn't a 50-person job. It wasn't even a 100-person job. They needed 1,000 people because it was real turf. So if you watch in the opening ceremony, they're rolling up turf, throwing it on their shoulders, carrying it down, going back and getting the next bit of turf and doing the same thing over and over and over again. So I think that was the biggest problem solved, is that when that energy and that culture took a dip, Danny Boyle himself just went straight in there to the problem, spoke to every single person and said, like, it's going to be okay. What you're doing is worth it. I know that we're in Dagenham. I know it's pouring with rain and the turf's getting really heavy and it's falling apart and you're covered in mud, but you're part of something spectacular, and just keep holding on to that vision. The other thing that he did was that originally we weren't meant to be keeping our costumes. Presumably they wanted to kind of collect them back in and like resell them, or I'm not quite sure what. But Danny Boyle just said, over my dead body, these people get to keep what they're wearing. And so the drummers, we had 3 different costumes. We had a Victorian costume. We had a kind of jeans and a jumper for the athletes parade. And then for the closing ceremony, we had this kind of blue blazer, a shirt, which had was a t-shirt that had a tie drawn onto it, and even like a bowler hat with a light bulb.
Which you are now, which, given this is audio only, you're actually wearing it. So I'm going to take some shots of us doing the podcast while we record this with you, with this on, so that people can see what we're talking about here.
We can do one. I'll put the hat on. If I wear it all the time, it can be a bit distracting.
Yeah, right. So I'm just gonna take some snapshots, but I love that idea that he's basically just decided that that's a really important thing, and I think that's really interesting because, to your point, this isn't about traditional rewards. It's about this is not about the monetary value of your uniforms, right? Because you could have got something for them, I'm sure, but it's thinking outside the box and going, what motivates human beings? And the answer is being able to keep a souvenir is the value to you as a record of your attendance is massive.
Yeah, huge. And what's amazing and lovely, and it's not really the topic of this chat, but a lot of the drummers were so inspired that they have carried on drumming. They made a group of drummers called the Pandemonium Drummers, which is what our section was called. And they have drummed in like FA Cup finals. They've drummed at marathons. They've drummed at pride parades. They're still the embodiment of what we were at the Olympics. And they wear these costumes. They wear the light bulbs and the jackets because it's our identity in a way. Yeah, it's amazing. It's incredible. But yeah, so that was one of the, a couple of problem solvings. The last one that was just quite funny. I mentioned earlier that we had earpieces in, so we could hear direction. And of course, up until the live rehearsals, everyone had rehearsed in their sections. So you hadn't had 10,000 people coming together, on the same stage, but we had to do that for the show itself. So we had these 3 practice rehearsals with a live audience, with the pyrotechnics. And I just remember in my earpiece, you could hear somebody going, like, watch out for Windrush, like Windrush is coming through, like make way. Like they can't see where they're going. And it turns out that, and you'll see it if you watch the opening ceremony back, they had, as part of that British history parade, they had a Windrush made of, essentially papier-mâché, which was being carried by people on stilts, and they could not see outside of that model. So you had probably, I don't know, half a dozen people carrying something blind, having to do a loop of the stadium, and everyone else just had to get out of their way. So just complete madness and chaos, but everybody learned very quickly if you see this Windrush papier-mâché marching towards you, like, get out of its way, because it just cannot see. It's an unstoppable ship. So
Literally. Love that. Love that. So this is interesting. So what you've talked about here is something that is pushing people to the limits in some cases, the physical stuff. It's getting people to do things they've never done before, either the particular skill or the scale on which it's being done. And you're working towards a deadline because you can't, the date is not moved, right? You can't delay the openings for a week or even a day or even an hour, right? It's got to happen at that particular point in time. So there's a huge amount of psychological pressure and excitement. And I think what you're really talking about here is the human spirit coming through, which is beautifully on brand for the Olympics of, well, we just have to bloody make this work, right? We have to get through this and we need to just keep going. And so I'm guessing lots of stress, but also lots of laughs, I'm assuming, as you're working out how this all comes together, because this is pushing people to their limits. And I think it's interesting when we push people to the limits, they can sometimes do crazy things, but it sounds like it was under control because the culture was the right kind of culture. Back to your point about Danny Boyle setting the tone from the top, but also you were all there with a mission and purpose, and you know that you have to succeed on this one night. And it's not like it's a performance that you're going to repeat. So if we screw up the first one, it doesn't matter, right? As long as we get it right. By the end of the series is the one night.
Yeah, exactly. And so that kind of brings me on to kind of my last main point, which is that hashtag Save the Surprise that you mentioned in the LinkedIn post. And, while we got talking about this, that was only introduced during the 3 live rehearsals. And it was mainly for the audience that were watching those 3 rehearsals. So we did 3 of them, and there's about 70,000 people in the stadium. So you've got a lot of people.
Oh, okay. So there's 3, because I always thought there was 1. So
No.
It's 70,000 times 3. So the scale of the challenge is even bigger.
Huge. Yeah. And we did need those 3 rehearsals. And for all 3, we were in the stadium at what is now, West Ham Stadium in the Olympic Park. They finished at about 2 a.m. And then obviously the tube wasn't running. So everyone just had to kind of figure out a way to get home and get to work the next day. I just remember being exhausted. Really, fortunately, I should, shout out to the FSA. They did give me some kind of community affairs days for these things. So that was nice. But yeah, for those 3 rehearsals, they used that hashtag mainly for people who were sat in the audience because they had access to their phones. Whereas all the performers, we shouldn't have had our phones on us. Of course, there was, the odd person that did kind of carry them around and take a couple of snaps. But for most people, we didn't have our phones on us anyway, so we couldn't really leak anything.
Because you weren't allowed to, or because it just wasn't practical to have them?
Well, we weren't allowed them. Our costumes didn't have pockets. Whether that was by design, I don't know. But the costume is just, there's literally nothing to them. They're very, very
well, I guess
basic.
why have the extra expense of putting pockets in? But
Yeah,
you do remind me, I'm going way back when I did some work with school summer job working, or it was a Christmas job actually, working Marks and Spencer. That's the one thing I remember is that all of the trousers didn't have pockets so that you couldn't nick things. So I guess it's cheaper, but so that's a dual purpose, right? Smart. It's cheaper to build things without that. That's a really interesting example. You've mitigated. You can't stop everybody, but that's making it much harder for you to do that.
Exactly. And I would say of the people that were invited in the audience, certainly all of the performers got 2 tickets to bring friends or family along. So a lot of the audience were our friends and family. And of course, like, my mum and dad aren't going to ruin this for everybody else. So
right, otherwise you'd have one of those conversations where you've let me down, but most of all you've let yourself down type thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but that's interesting, right? So there's a vested interest in you succeeding. I hadn't realized that the majority of people that were invited to those things were connected to. It makes perfect sense, right? It's another reward and incentive for you. And particularly, I guess, if you've got a family who've not seen you and heard that you're doing this thing, that's a nice way to recognize their contribution in supporting you. Just being patient, I guess, in the worst case, but maybe with people with childcare or whatever, right? It's genuinely supporting in another sense. And so that works well on 2 levels because that's helping you because you're getting something out of it and you can share the experience with someone else and let them in on the secret/surprise early. But more interestingly, they're incentivized not to spill the beans.
That's exactly it. And what the hashtag allowed people to do was, of course, these days, if things aren't on social media, they didn't happen. So it gave people an avenue to post and say, I was at the rehearsals. It's going to be amazing. Hashtag Save the Surprise. So people got to brag about going if they so wished to. without posting any kind of videos or pictures. Obviously, technology in 2010, it wasn't quite as advanced, but, people still could have gotten the odd picture out, but nothing went on Twitter at all because we were all checking it afterwards and making sure, because none of us wanted it to be ruined either. So I think that really helped. Another thing that helped was that each section really only knew what we were doing. And
so this is the French resistance principle,
Yeah.
right? That you just know what
Yeah.
your cell is doing and you can't blow the full thing because you don't know.
Precisely. So it was only when we were doing those dress rehearsals that we were like, oh my goodness, there's a whole section staffed by NHS nurses. So there was, the first section of the opening ceremony was the moving from the Green and Pleasant Lounge to the Victorian era. And then the next section was a dance section. So there were loads of dancers that had this whole house party idea and they get on the tube and things. And then there was another section where it was NHS nurses. It was dedicated to the NHS and to Great Ormond Street Hospital. And J.K. Rowling read one of the kind of children's stories there. And there were Dementors in it, and Mary Poppins came along and scared away the Dementors. So it was a real mishmash. We didn't know about any of that. We met each other in costume at the rehearsals. And it was like, what are you? Well, what are you? You're a roller skating Dementor. Okay, fine. Normal.
Obviously.
Yeah, obviously. And there were kids on bouncing beds. There were, you would see, I remember seeing it was like a Beatles car, but we didn't know that was going to feature. And then of course there were the Beatles, kind of people dressed as the Beatles standing alongside it. And this was one of the things that Danny Boyle told us, you either have a solo person, just one person that the camera focuses on. So that would be people like Kenneth Branagh or J.K. Rowling, or you need 20 of them for it to be seen by the camera. So we didn't just have 4 Beatles, we had kind of 80 Beatles. And we didn't just have, 1 or 2 Dementors. There were 50 Dementors, skating all over this place, chasing children. So, until we got to those rehearsals, nobody knew what each other was doing. And it was, that segmentation really did help with keeping things quite secret.
That's super interesting. And at this point, I guess to your point around the risks here, the interesting bit in terms of the secrecy, I don't mean the risks of the event, I guess you're prepping for it. That element of surprise for you. On the one hand, I guess you're kind of going, well, this is much more than I was expecting. On the other hand, there's a little bit, I guess there's just bewilderment about the whole thing. And so a recognition that if I were thinking about it as sort of, if you were malicious and you wanted to leak stuff, you'd have had to go through a hell of a lot as an undercover reporter to get to this final point. But it's also, you're kind of a bit overwhelmed because suddenly you're back to the French resistance thing, right? The information that you might have had about your little bit, you've just realized that's just part of it, right? That's not good. So even if you had given away all the stuff that you knew, you're suddenly being made aware that you don't know the half of it, right? You haven't really got a full perspective on anything. It wasn't designed for this purpose, right? Because you need people to practice independently, but that bringing together at the end would, if you were telling it for all the right reasons like you were, you'd be like, whoa, there's an element of surprise there for you in that moment. And that kind of helps because you recognize it's the same surprise that the audience is going to have for the real thing in a few days' time, in a few weeks' time, whatever. But it's also sort of would undermine your ability to, if you were minded to breach the confidentiality, it would undermine your ability to do that. And you'd recognize that.
Exactly. It was a bit like during those dress rehearsals, we were given the puzzle pieces, but we had no way of knowing how all of those pieces fit together. We only knew our 20-minute segment, and it's a 3.5-hour show. So it really put it into scale, just how little kind of you knew. And everyone was also quite secretive about their different areas. I would say, well, I'm a drummer. That's all I can say. I'm not telling you anything else. We'd kind of be drumming out our beats, but the people who did the NHS section wouldn't have known that the Green and Pleasant Lounge get torn away, revealing a Victorian era where, the Olympic rings are made through iron, poured iron, and the fireworks go off. They didn't get to see any of that until the very, very last minute. I think we did the 3 rehearsals night after night after night. And then we had kind of 2 nights rest, and then it was the final. So it really was the week of the Olympics itself. And to your point, that's not a deadline that can move. I think, business is very used to deadlines kind of shifting a little bit and shifting a little bit more. But this was, that's when it's happening. We're going live, 6 p.m. no matter what. Let's hope it's not raining. And so I think the last bit that they kept secret was the videos. So in between, you had the live sections in the stadium, and then while things were kind of being cleared away and prepared for the next section, they had little VTs, little videos in between. And those weren't even shown during the 3 live rehearsals. And one of those was when Daniel Craig goes and picks up the Queen. And so at that point, it was just save the surprise, and that you could hear the audio. So you could hear kind of noise being played, but we had no idea. But there were all these whisperings because Daniel Craig had been filmed going into Buckingham Palace. But we still didn't know until the night itself exactly what that section was. And nobody knew about Mr. Bean either. You might remember Rowan Atkinson, they're playing the Chariots of Fire, and then Rowan Atkinson is there and he's playing the synth. Yeah. And nobody knew about that either. So even the night itself, they had actually saved a few surprises from the volunteers. So yeah, it was incredible what was pulled off.
So I've got this real sense of meticulous planning and just deep thought, I guess, into the human dynamics. And I think the reason I found the whole save the surprise thing so engaging was that I just thought in that one phrase, and the fact that, and I'm also willing to believe, right, sometimes you can come up with amazing things and we all retrofit logic and go, yeah, sometimes chance plays a massive role in these things. But it sounds like, from what you were saying, that if you looked at it, they did a pretty good job of all this stuff, very professionally handled, very well done. And so almost a recognition, and I guess this is what happens when you bring experts that have done this thing before, but it's just really, really well done behind the scenes. And that's a good illustration, I think, of the strength of planning, but also thinking psychologically, right? You talked a lot about a lot of the mitigants and processes that are in place rely on a really deep understanding of what makes humans tick.
No, for sure. They really do.
And so clearly you've got no regrets about doing it, because obviously you're happy to talk about it now and enjoy it. Were there moments where you went, I can't be doing this?
No, to be honest, because the reason why I got chosen as a drummer, when you went to interview.
Oh yeah. I had to talk about that. That's interesting.
Yeah, because that was, really, really lucky. So you went to interview and there was tens of thousands of people interviewing. And then right at the end of a full day of interviewing where they'd got us to, they were like, they taught us a dance routine, but it was more a dance. It was very random, like you're brushing your teeth in the morning, you're getting out of bed and stretching. It was a very straight, it was essentially, can people follow instructions? Are they?
Right. Sounds like one of those awful breakfast cereal ads, yeah. Right?
Well, the worst part, but it was quite funny, is that they'd go, okay, and now here's the freestyle dance part. And then all the professional dancers would be doing backflips and twirls and really showcasing their talents. So they would get picked out as dancers. And then everyone else would just sort of be doing the YMCA, not knowing what to do. So I remember at the end of, that interview, because it was a big audition, really, thinking I've got absolutely no chance. I am not talented enough for this. There are, just some incredible people here. And then they said, if there's anybody that works for the NHS, if there's anybody that can skate, and if there's anybody that's a ballerina, and if there's anybody that was a drummer, come to the corner. And I was like, oh my God, I can drum.
I can do all of those things. I don't work for the NHS, but I could pretend.
Yeah. And I was like, I'm a drummer. That's my thing. Because I was in a marching band. So from the age of 12 until mid-20s, right, I was in a marching band for a charity riding organization called the Horse Rangers Association. And best believe I was laughed at every single parade we did, because you're wearing kind of jodhpurs and a green shirt covered in badges. And I'd be playing the snare drum, and I also played a bell lyre, and I played a trumpet. So I was very used to, and I think this is what meant I was totally okay with this process. I was very used to standing around and doing nothing and just being waited for instruction. I'm so good at that. I had perfected that over 10 years of being in a marching band.
I think you say you perfected that at the regulator.
Yeah, it was really okay, cool. We just need, the army's phrase, I think, is hurry up and wait or something. But it was a bit, Horse Rangers band was like that. We would have to, get up at the crack of dawn, drive somewhere, do kind of 3 Remembrance Sunday parades in a row, stand in silence. And that was the role of being in a band. And so I think, the band taught me how to play the drum, and that got me the drum roll. And it also taught me to just trust the process, follow instructions, be quiet, let other people do the thinking. Sometimes you just need to sit back and let the professionals run
well,
it.
that's interesting, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
you sort of, you need to be excited enough to want to
Mm.
do this, right? To go through with all of this, but you also need a sense of self-discipline,
Yeah.
right? So I could imagine, like, for me, with my temperament, I would be like, yeah, of course I'd love to have the experience of having done it, right? It's a really cool thing to be part of, but can I be bothered with all of this highly disciplined training? Yeah, that is why I will never be. Let's ignore the skill set for a second. That's why I'll never be a professional sports person, because I'm I'm crap at it, but I just don't have that sense of dedication to the craft. And so that's an interesting thing, is that what you're looking for, to your point, and this is, I guess, I hadn't really thought about I could see why you would want to test people's skills for technical roles, but there's an aptitude thing here, right? Which
Yeah.
is, we need to know that you can see this thing through. And so one of the ways that we're looking for technical skills, and can you do the drumming or the rollerblading, whatever, right? But also this sort of personality type.
Yeah. Of just can you for hours just sit around? Because, 5 hours on a Sunday every single weekend from January to July, that's a lot. To your point earlier, people were having to arrange childcare, their partners were looking after the kids, or they were traveling down from Scotland or from Devon, from all over the place. So people were sacrificing a lot of their personal time to then sit in a car park and just be quiet, and keep your head down until your 12 minutes or your 20-minute performance, and then be quiet again. So I think, yeah, you needed both people. You needed performers, but you also needed people that just had that no ego, and who were very happy to be a very small piece of the puzzle. And I think that's where, that is the world of arts. If you think any performance that goes on, any theatre show that happens, they do hundreds of hours of rehearsal for that show. And a lot of it is you're not sat on the West End stage, you're sat in some social club somewhere, rehearsing your lines for hours at a time, or you're at home alone, but you've got in mind that end performance, and that's what makes it all worth it and gets you through. But it's not for everyone. It's, there is a certain personality type, and I think that's where the audition process filters through. Like any kind of loudmouths, any people who was, thought that they were like the star, they just got whittled out. It just wasn't for them. You really needed people who were very committed to being one of 10,000, and that we were.
So, with the exception of the fact that it is an individual thing, you're almost talking about the same discipline that you need to be an Olympian.
Funnily enough, yes. Honestly, it, not in terms of like the sports talent,
Yeah.
but in terms of that dedication of showing up, doing the same thing over and over again. Like, we, as drummers, we had to just march right foot, left foot, right foot, left foot, and we had a few different drumming pieces to play along with the click track, obviously, and there was a soundtrack that we played along to. But you just had to rehearse those same things over and over and over again. And it was good because there were a lot of professional drummers within the drum corps. But there were some people who weren't drummers who also struggled with just going left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. Not everybody's got natural rhythm. And so some people did need to learn. People who were slightly better, like I got made a drum captain, which, I'm very proud of. And that meant that I led a snake of 20 people. So we went from our changing rooms essentially and walked in a row of 20 people pretty much halfway around the stadium. And then I led my line of people up what was the Glastonbury tour. So there's one shot on BBC iPlayer, which is a shot of 𝗀𝗃 with the camera looking up on the tour. And you can kind of see me at the top there with my massive drum. But we got there because I was kind of leading people. So, they delegated tasks around to make sure people got into the right places. There were drummers all over the place. They were in the aisles, standing behind people, walking around the green and pleasant lands as well. So 1,000 people were doing a lot of walking, actually. So there was a fair amount of exercise, but a hell of a lot of discipline. Especially just, when someone says, be silent, you need to be silent, because Danny Boyle can't shout over 10,000 people. So it was also that, have fun when they said have fun, and then be absolutely silent when that's necessary too. Because otherwise the volume, if you've got all these people with 1,000 drums, that's a hell of a lot of noise. So there was a lot of personal control that was necessary.
Wow. And so as obviously we're recording this at the time of the Paris Olympics. Presumably you watch these ceremonies go forward with a I guess just to sort of with a different perspective to the rest of us, but I presume you are an avid watcher of them.
I am. I honestly like the Brazil. What I love about them is they really encapsulate and embody each country's culture. So China, they had a drumming section as well, and it was we referred to it quite often. The Chinese drumming section was absolutely pristine, perfect. They were to the millimeter in time with each other. And Danny Boyle was like, "That's not really very British, though," it says. We're going to have you dressed as Victorians. You're not going to be wearing any makeup. You're going to be wearing bonnets. You're going to have plant pots with tennis balls, and you're just going to have a bit more. It's just going to be a bit more rough and ready and a bit more fun and a bit less perfect. And that's how it compared. And then, with the Brazil ceremony, that was just one long carnival because that's Brazil. So that was there. We got a taste of it actually in the closing ceremony because I also did the closing ceremony. So this costume's a closing ceremony. Brazil came on and whetted the appetite for theirs. And their costumes were just out of this world. I mean, the closing ceremony, the Spice Girls were there. So like that was a huge, I could see them on the stage. They were so close. That was amazing for me. And then we've got Paris coming up, and it'll be so interesting to see like what are the French going to do? I don't know. I'm really looking forward to seeing it. I'm going to be in France when it happens. I probably won't get to Paris because it'll be so busy, but I definitely will watch it, and I'll think of all those volunteers because I guarantee they'll have gone through exactly the same process of just hundreds of hours of rehearsals and, and just dedication, really. That's all the ingredients you need.
Love it. I think that's the perfect note on which to finish. Victoria, thank you so much for coming on the show to share experiences. I've learned a ton of things. As ever, when you go behind the scenes, there's things that you weren't aware of, quite rightly, right? Because we're there to look at the show. But I think there's some really, really super interesting lessons about how to manage people, how to inspire them, but also, as you say, manage a kind of classic kind of compliance rituals. How do you get people to keep a secret? So thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about those things.
It's been a pleasure, honestly. I love walking down this particular memory lane, so anytime.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to you for listening and to Victoria for appearing. To find out more about Victoria, including her work at 6 Degrees Wealth, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the show, thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like this episode, please do leave us a review. It really helps to get the word out. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, visit the show's website, humanriskpodcast.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the show. But in the meantime, stay safe, enjoy the Olympics, and thank you so much for listening.